Last week, we looked at how Revelation is a work of apocalypse. Now, if you don't know what that means, I'll link to last week's sermon up there. But if you just need a bit of a refresher, what that means is that it is a genre of resistance literature that uses spiritually significant symbols in order to help us see behind the curtain into the unseen spiritual realm so that we can discern what is going on there. Revelation wasn't written to churches in the 21st century. It isn't a break glass in case of end of world appendix at the back of our Bible. Rather, it is a letter that was written to the church in the first century to help them discern their own times so that they could live faithfully to Jesus in them. And it is relevant to us today because it calls us to that same level of discernment about our own time. Now, the book of Revelation has many different symbols that symbolize evil. The top dog in all of this is the dragon, which represents Satan. But Satan has two different beasts that work for it. And then there is this associated thing called Babylon. So in order to understand what Babylon is as a symbol here, we need to understand the history of God's people and Babylon. So Babylon was an empire in Israel's region during the time of the Old Testament, the late Old Testament. And they have the ignoble distinction of being the people that took the Jews into exile. The Old Testament prophet Habakkuk complained to God about how the Israelites were living so unjustly, and God promised that he was going to use the Babylonians, a shocking choice because they are so cruel and brutal themselves, so worthy of judgment, as his tool to chasten the Jewish people. And so he responds to Habakkuk's charges this way in Habakkuk chapter 1, starting in verse 6. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor, guilty people whose own strength is their God. No doubt, if you've spent time in Sunday school, you probably are aware of one of their kings, a fellow by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. I bet he had to spell his name every time he made a reservation at a restaurant. Nebuchadnezzar is so full of himself that he demands worship. He sets up a giant statue of himself and demands that all the officials in his kingdom bow down and worship that statue. But 3 Jewish officials in his kingdom, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to bow the knee to the statue. Enraged by their unwillingness to acknowledge him as worthy of worship, he has them tied up and thrown into a fiery furnace. While God delivers them, this episode is illustrative of how he is brutal and how he is arrogant. And so the whole kingdom sort of follows the culture of its leader. Now, despite its power, Babylon was overthrown easily by Persia, a fitting judgment of God on the people for their arrogance and their oppression. And Babylon becomes a symbol with spiritual resonance for all of God's people. In their excellent book, Revelation for the Rest of Us, which I would highly recommend you read if you're interested in this kind of approach to the book that I've been looking at, Scott McKnight and Cody Matchett say this: Babylon became for Jews and early Christians the most graphic image, metaphor, or trope for a city filled with arrogance, sin, injustice, oppression of God's people, and idolatry. Anyone who acts like Babylon bears the badge, Babylon. Now, Revelation exposes this struggle going on in the spiritual world. And while Babylon is a past reality, the same spiritual forces that animated Babylon are still at work in the time of John's writing, probably in the late first century, the 90s of the first century AD. And those forces are exemplified by the people and the empire of Rome. Just as Babylon enslaved God's people, it oppressed them and it demanded worship, so Rome has occupied the Holy Land, enslaving God's people. It brutally oppresses them and it demands worship. And so, just as Rome is a new Babylon, so any human institution that bears the marks of Babylon can be said to be Babylon. So how do we recognize Babylon when we see it? Well, I think one of the ways that's really helpful is us to look at the beast that commands Babylon and understand what it's all about. And there's a particular passage that has been wildly misinterpreted that I think it might be helpful for us to understand here. It's in Revelation 13, 16 to 18. It says, "It, the beast, also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Now, 666 has received so much speculation over the years. Conspiracy theorists love to point out how the 666 applies to their favorite boogeyman. And so you'll find people saying that it's Bill Gates or George Soros or the European Union or Prince Charles before he was King Charles. But John's writing here, if we read it closely, precludes any modern person being the fulfillment of 666. He's saying to his original audience, and remember, Revelation is not written to us, it is written to the Jews in the 7 churches in Asia Minor in the first century. And he basically says that they should be able to figure out who he's talking about. This is a nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of thing. And he says that the person's name is a number, or that you can calculate who they are. This points towards the Jewish practice of gematria, which assigns numerical values to letters of the alphabet. Now, if you were to take the name of the hated Roman emperor, Nero Caesar, in Greek, Neron Caesar, and you were to transliterate that into the Hebrew alphabet. Transliteration is when you take a word spelled in one alphabet and you spell it with the letters of another alphabet. And then you used gematria in the traditional numerical values, you end up with numbers that total up to 666. Now, if you were to use the Latin version of his name, Nero Caesar, the one that we're more familiar with, you get 616. And there are manuscripts of Revelation that are early on. They're really old manuscripts that say 616 here instead of 666, which seems to suggest that a scribe, seeing this, understood it to be a reference to Nero, but thought he could clarify it by changing the name that they're converting from Neron Caesar, the less familiar version, to Nero Caesar, the more familiar version. So he's trying to be helpful, and that ends up buttressing the idea that this is a reference to Nero Caesar. But I think that there's a reason why he uses the 666, but I'll get to that in a second. Nero Caesar, at the time of this writing, is dead. He died in the 60s. So why is he pointing at somebody in the past? Well, remember that John is pointing towards Babylon, an empire that is no more, but he's pointing in reality towards Rome. And in the same way that Babylon becomes sort of an archetype to understand Rome, Nero is an archetype to understand the person who is the current emperor at the time of writing. That's a guy by the name of Domitian. And so Domitian is like a new Nero. Now, the numbers in Revelation are very significant. And in Revelation, 7 is a number that represents perfection. It's God's number. In the Genesis creation story, God creates humanity on the 6th day. And 6 is almost but not quite 7. And so it is a number of aspiration but imperfection. Now, it's also true that 3 has significant number in Revelation. John never uses the word Trinity. The word never actually appears in the Bible, but he obviously has a Trinitarian understanding of God. In the initial address, he addresses it from the one who was and is to come, God the Father, from the 7 spirits before the throne, God the Spirit, and from Jesus Christ, God the Son. And so when you take this thing that is 6, almost God, but falling short, and it is associated with humanity, and you put 3 of them together, it's creating an unholy trinity. It's creating a picture of humanity striving after divinity. Now, this wasn't invented by Nero or Rome, or even Babylon before it. In order to understand the origin of this, we have to go all the way back. The genesis of this, I use the word intentionally, comes from the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Adam and Eve are forbidden by God from taking the fruit from the forbidden tree. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, God is saying to them, the one thing you can't do is decide for yourself what is right and wrong. You need to listen to me instead. But by taking the forbidden fruit, they declare themselves to be able to decide what is right and what is wrong. And so we have the beginning of sin, or old creation, broken creation, sinful creation. And that original act of rebellion cuts them off from God, just as our acts of rebellion, our sin, cut us off from God. We're meant to draw our life from God, who is our creator and our sustainer, but we can't because we refuse to be his people. And when we are cut off from God, when we are cut off from the source, we end up having to try and take what we need from other people. And so we extract. And when everybody extracts, eventually the person who is the best at extracting rises up to the top. And we have the birth of empire. Empire is really the maturation of the corruption of Adam and Eve's original act of disobedience. It is the manifestation of old creation at its logical conclusion. So Babylon 666 points to Nero so that we can understand Domitian. And it points to the fact that he holds himself up as if he is divine. Babylon is humans and human institutions pretending that they are divine at the direction of spiritual forces of evil. Now, when humans or human institutions stand in the place of God, the result is always violence and oppression. As I said, people are meant to draw their life from him. And they begin to extract from each other, and so you have the birth of an empire. An empire is one person being the beneficiary of everybody else's work. And so it's fundamentally unjust. But in order to justify this culture of extraction, people come up with lies about who they are and what the problem is. So Nero and the other Caesars said that they were the Lord and the Savior, and they were a gift from the gods. First of all, they misidentify what the big problem in life is. Of course, what Jesus shows us is that the problem that we need to be delivered from is the fact that we are subject to sin and death and corruption. And that's why it takes his forgiving work to set the world on a path to healing. But the Babylons of this world will tell you that something else is the problem. Often it is a genuine problem, but it's just not the problem. And so even if it were to solve that problem, it wouldn't solve the problems that really ail us on the deepest levels. And so Rome says, well, the problem is that you're not prosperous enough and that you're not strong enough. This is, by the way, consumerism and militarism. And it says, we can give you salvation by providing strength and prosperity. But strength just doesn't mean that we're going to be able to withstand anything. It means that we're going to go out and bust some heads. that we'll bring peace by, subduing everybody who might resist us. And the promise of prosperity is only enjoyed by the few, and it comes at the expense of the many. And so Rome makes promises about how it's going to solve this big problem, but it doesn't actually deliver on those promises. But if you call it out, if you speak truth to power, well, then there's crosses for that. It cannot tolerate exposure of its lies because that delegitimizes its use of power. The emperor is wearing no clothes, but it wouldn't do to tell him so. If we were to look at this in a more modern context, we might look at, say, the Soviet Union. Marx, the father of communism, says that the big problem is the exploitation of workers by the managerial class. And to be fair, exploitation of the people who have less power by people who have more power is a problem, but it's not the problem. And he puts forward that the solution to this problem is that the workers seize the means of production. So the Soviet Union, drawing on his philosophical outlook, says that we're going to create a workers' paradise. Well, first of all, that's not going to solve everybody's problem. But secondly, they don't do a good job of even creating a workers' paradise. Instead, they simply create a state that justifies their own privilege and extraction of wealth and position from the people underneath them. And they also, like Rome, will tolerate no dissent. You can't say, you guys were aiming at creating a workers' paradise, but you've created more of a workers' dystopia. Because if you said that in a public forum in the Soviet Union, you'd probably find yourself in a gulag. And so we see that human institutions that hold themselves up as God, Babylon, is extracting from people. It is oppressing them violently because it needs to justify its own wealth and power and privilege and position. Now, Babylon is a system of self-justifying exploitative power. It seems invincible, but God will judge it. In Revelation, the judgment doesn't even happen on screen, if you will. It happens off screen and is merely announced, as if to say this was never a worry that God even had, that he felt the need to narrate it. In Revelation chapter 18, 1-3, we read this. After this, I saw an angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." Babylon tells the world that it is invincible, but it crumbles before the judgment of God. But that judgment from God comes with a warning to God's people. Continuing on in verses 4 and 5, we read this. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes." Why is it so important that God's people come out of Babylon? If they do not, they will become complicit with the crimes that Babylon has been committing. We can see this in our own history, shocking examples of people who claimed the label of Christian, but who were willing participants with empires in their acts of oppression and injustice. We could say the Spanish Inquisition, the British Empire, the German Church under the Third Reich. If we do not discern, we might become a tool of Babylon rather than a community that embodies the alternative to it. Now, Babylon is a communal thing. But communities are shaped by the choices of the individuals within them. And so this Babylon thing is not just a problem for leaders. It is a problem for all of us. Because if we behave in certain ways, if we value certain things, then we foster a community in which Babylon thrives. And so we need to look at our lives, look at things that might seem like small choices, but they together build Babylon brick by brick. So when we put others down so that we feel better about ourselves, we're fostering Babylon. When we buy things that confer status upon us because they confer status upon us and make us feel superior to those who don't have them, then we're buying into Babylon's system. When we engage in hostility towards people who don't like us, we are fostering Babylon. You might say that Jesus is hostile. Jesus is harsh towards the people who disagree with him, but it's always with a desire to see them come to repentance, never with the malicious glee to see them judged by God. When we seek personal power, justifying it by saying that we'll use it for the benefit of others, we are unleashing Babylon. Nobody stands with power. Everybody uses power for their own benefit. The only one who can be trusted absolutely with power is the one who made himself nothing, giving up power for the sake of everyone else. And of course, that is Jesus. When our highest value becomes anything other than knowing God and receiving his kingdom, then we are planting the seeds of Babylon. We look to things that are good things, but created things. Things like career advancement, romantic relationships, financial stability. These are good things, but they cannot bear the weight of expectation of being God in our lives. And so when we have those things, and they don't satisfy us, we tend to double down to try and get more, rather than understanding that those things can never actually make good on the promises that we think that they will fulfill in our lives. It is only when we direct our heart and our attention towards God that we can receive that kingdom, that we can embody the alternative. Because Babylon is seductive and insidious, and if we aren't discerning, we will find ourselves under its authority. But there's another way, a way of resistance. Just as Adam embodies the old way, the corrupt nature, the second Adam, Jesus Christ, embodies that new creation. The new creation that Revelation shows us as the way of the Lamb. To be continued.